Hey kiddos, so today we're going to talk about the growth of cities and American culture. This is a period of time that is happening simultaneously as the rise of industry, so what we talked about in chapter 16. And really what we're looking at today is how the combination of the rise in industry, in addition to a rise in immigration, is going to lead to urbanization. So more and more people living in cities and the effects that that is going to have on the socioeconomic status, in addition to like living and working conditions. So let's first start with this rise in immigration. In between 1850 and 1900, the United States population more than tripled. So in 1850, it was at 23 million, and by 1900, 76.2 million. In addition to the rise in the birth rate, 16.2 million immigrants are going to help fuel that growth. So one of the things that's important is understanding the difference between a push factor and a pull factor. So in Europe, there were causes that pushed immigrants out, right? So negative things going on in Europe that caused them to look to immigrate somewhere else. So you have a lot of poverty and displaced farm workers. There's a lot of political turmoil in Eastern Europe at this point in time, a lot of discrimination that also exists. Mechanization of farm equipment caused the farms to be more productive, which means they needed less farm hands, and so that's going to become an issue. There's a lot of overcrowding and high unemployment in some of the urban cities in Europe because of a large population boom that grew throughout Europe in probably the last century or so. And then religious persecution. The Jewish people in Eastern Europe were highly persecuted around this time period. So they want to leave. But what made them come to America? That is a pull factor. So if you are an Italian that is struggling financially at this point in time, and you know that you want to immigrate somewhere, what makes you choose the United States versus the United Kingdom? And so a pull factor is this reputation for political and religious freedom. The economic opportunities associated with kind of the American dream that exists around the world by this point in time. And then they also know that there are a lot of industrial jobs because remember from what we learned in the last chapter that industry was on the rise, in addition to the fact that the West is being opened up with the Transcontinental Railroad and the jobs and land that offers with like the Homestead Act and things like that. So even though we know the Homestead Act and this idea of the American dream was kind of limited, in hindsight, but at this time, a lot of immigrants had heard that they're giving away free land to immigrants and people in the United States. In addition to that, it was a lot cheaper than it had been previously to get to the United States. So with the technology, inexpensive one-way tickets, they're living in like these steerage conditions, which weren't that great, but it wasn't taking 3 months like it did for the Pilgrims, 100 years before, 200 years before. Now it was taking a matter of like a couple of weeks in order to get there. And the tickets were very cheap, which before this, you had to have money leaving Europe. So with that, because it was less expensive to get there, what it does is it opens up the types of immigrants that are going to be coming to the United States. So especially socioeconomically. So what we've learned about before is like in the early 1800s and mid 1800s, basically anyone before 1880, these are considered old immigrants. So this is the old immigrant group. They're mostly from Northwestern Europe. They're from Britain, Germany, Scandinavia. So that's like Finland and Sweden, Denmark. Most are Protestant and most spoke English, or they were willing to learn English. Most of them were willing to assimilate. Now during this, and they were okay, right? They were discriminated a little bit, but most of them, like they came into the country, they spread out, they moved into kind of the old Northwest, so what we would call the Midwest today. And they assimilated. They learned English. There were a lot of Irish that came in during this period because of the famine that existed in Ireland, and they were discriminated against the most of these old immigrants, and most of that had to do with the fact that they practiced Catholicism. In addition to, they kind of had, a negative context for like drinking, but the Germans did too a little bit. But the Irish were the most discriminated group of the old immigrants. Why they were seen as more acceptable was because they have a higher literacy rate. They had occupational skills. So because, again, it was a little bit more expensive to come here, so they would sell everything that they had, come over, and so, but they had a skill. They had something in mind that they were going to do, whether it be farming or, working in a city, doing whatever skilled job, artisan job. They did a fairly good job of blending in and, again, and assimilating. So after the 1880s, so it's probably starting in 1890, these are considered new immigrants. These were people from Southern and Eastern Europe. So we're looking at Italy, Greece, Croatia, Slovakia, Poland, Russia. And they were deemed, most of them are poor, they're illiterate. Most of them were either Catholic or Orthodox, like Eastern Orthodox, so Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, a lot of Jews during this time period. And so one of the reasons that they were discriminated against was because their religion was very different. They weren't Protestant. There was a lot of, and this is kind of confusing to a lot of kids, because why were they, I mean, they're all Christian, right? So like Jesus is there. That's kind of the purpose of their religion, is that they all believe that in Jesus Christ. However, there was a growing view since the time of the Pilgrims that Protestantism, because of like the Great Awakenings and the questioning that existed among the Protestant people, that they were going to question the church, and they deemed that that was superior to that of people that were more traditional in the Catholic and the Orthodox churches, because they just like blindly follow the Pope and wherever their head of church is. That they, because remember, most of the Catholic services and Eastern Orthodox services, some were even still done in Latin, which means that you don't hear what the priest is saying. You don't really understand what the priest is saying. That might not be true in the Eastern Orthodox churches, where it's like they speak in Greek and whatnot. But I know for the Catholic Church, for sure, they were still speaking in Latin. So a lot of the parishioners, the people that are in Mass, they don't know what's being said. Where in the United States with the Protestant church, they believed that your relationship with God had most to do with like your mind and how you thought critically about your relationship with God. And so Americans really deemed themselves as Protestants, as like superior because of the critical thinking part. That's why it was kind of controversial, even in 1960, when JFK was the first Catholic president to be elected. Politicians were discriminated against if they were Catholic, because they worried that they would be influenced by the Pope instead of to the people, right? Because in the Catholic faith, who is your number one, what's more important, your religion and the Pope, or is it the people of the United States? And so that was kind of controversial, and they were discriminated against because of that. So that's a little background as to why they were discriminatory towards Catholics. I think that probably the most important reason why they were also discriminated against was the fact that instead of spreading out and moving west, most of them, because they were so poor and because it was such an affordable or cheap ticket to get to the United States, once they got there, they clustered in these ethnic neighborhoods. So if you're looking in New York, like even today, like there's Little Italy and there's, Little Havana. There were Croatian neighborhoods and Slavic and Russian. And so what they would do is they would come over, and it would kind of be word of mouth, right? They know that someone from their village moved to Boston or moved to New York City or moved to Chicago, and they would move into these ethnic neighborhoods, which prevented them from really assimilating. So they still spoke their native language. The churches that popped up were of Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox or whatnot. And so that became a problem for a lot of natives, Americans, or nativists, right? The Know Nothing Party, the nativist party is still a thing, where they discriminated against these people because they were separate from them. They were almost segregated, and there was no assimilation. It was something that they had a difficult time in accepting. Now, about 25% of the new immigrants that are coming over were groups called birds of passage. So these were young men. They would work in factories. They would earn money. They would save it. They would send it back. Or they would just move back to to save the money, go back to their home country, and use that money to lift themselves up within that country. Okay. In other examples, the men would come over, they would work, they would save money, and then they would send for their families. That was something else that would happen. So this is a political cartoon that I think is important. This is another Joseph Kepler, which we've talked about a lot. I don't know if you can see that this is titled Welcome to All. And this was done in 1880. And what you can see here is kind of an allusion, right, to Noah's Ark. So you see Uncle Sam standing here at the entrance of the U.S. Ark of Refugee. It's very hard to tell, but on that sign, it says free education, free land, free ballot, free lunch. And obviously it's titled Welcome to All. So he is welcoming them. You'll also notice that we've seen this in some other images as well, where the American flag is, that part is like light and bright. And then if you look in the sky above, like where like Europe is, right? So these people are getting on the ark, that it's dark and ominous. So you have kind of these pull factors that are listed with the free education, free land, free speech, free ballot. And then there's also the sign that's not on the ark, but sitting like kind of almost where the gangway is, the plank there, where it says no oppressive taxes, no expensive king, no compulsory military service. And so those would kind of be your push factors. Those are things that people had to deal with. What's also interesting is if you look at the different types of couples here and how they are dressed. So you have like ethnic diversity. So you can see different cultures depending on how they're dressed, but also different socioeconomic. So you have some really wealthy people with the top hats. You have some, looks like peasants with no shoes and women carrying things on their heads. Some have luggage, some don't. And so this political cartoon kind of represents that, this is very similar to even like when the Statue of Liberty. So a lot of people know the Emma Lazarus poem where it says, give me you're tired, you're poor, you're weak, right? So the Statue of Liberty was donated by the French in 1876. So the centennial of the Declaration of Independence as our allies in the Revolutionary War. And it was put in New York City because that's where a lot of immigrants were coming. And it kind of alluded to the fact that, again, at that point in time, Americans were more open to the idea of immigration. Now, again, groups were still discriminated against, but it was more, there was that common theme as a part of how Americans viewed immigrants at that point in time, or at least the government maybe. There's still a lot of discrimination within the borders. If you fast forward 10 years, this was also done by Joseph Kepler in 1890 or 1890-ish. This is a little bit different. So here we have an immigrant that is coming off of the boat, and standing in front of him are these industrialists, right? They're dressed very well. They've got their top hats. They obviously come from money. And what you see here is they're telling him to stop. No, you can't come. But then you have these shadows behind them. And this is always a really interesting discussion to have with students. Like, what are those shadows? Who do they represent? The most common answer that what we've kind of determined as classes over the years, and even my interpretation, is that these men behind them are more than likely their grandfathers or their fathers, right? Because we are a nation of immigrants. If you are a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which most of the industrialists were, living in the United States in the 19th century, you are a descendant of an immigrant at some point. And so what Kepler is doing is highlighting the hypocrisy of why was it okay for your father or grandfather or even yourself to take advantage of the American immigration policy and the American dream. Why could they go after their American dream, but these men and these families can't? And so that's what Joseph Kepler is kind of highlighting here. Now, we've already learned a little bit about the discrimination that the Chinese face in chapter 17. The Chinese Exclusion Act, just to review, is the only piece of legislation that banned immigrants from a specific country. They're considered undesirable. So if you were to imagine the discrimination felt towards people that were Christian, right? So the Italians or the Greeks or the Croatians, or even the Irish, the Chinese were even more discriminated against because they're not even Christian. It's a completely different group. In addition to that, they were coming in high numbers on the West Coast. They're working on the railroads. They're doing jobs that most whites didn't want to do, and they were doing it for lower amounts. So they were paid less money. And so there was a lot of discrimination towards them to where they didn't want to have to compete. That's a continuity in this country when it looks to like xenophobia and immigration policies. One of the first accusations is that the immigrants are taking our jobs. Even though Chinese workers on the railroad died at a much higher rate, the work that they did was much more dangerous. And they were also put in those dangerous situations because they were seen as expendable, because they were seen as undesirable or less than. So there are a few different groups that were in favor of restricting immigrants. One is going to be the labor unions. Remember that wages were decided based on supply and demand, so it's the supply of labor. So when lots of immigrants were coming into the country and there were lots of people to work and willing to accept those low wages, it hurt the labor unions' ability to be able to use collective bargaining and strikes, because the immigrants would serve as strike breakers. They would be willing to work for the low wages because it was better than what they had back in their home countries. And so labor unions were in favor of restricting immigration. In addition to that, just the nativists as a whole, who were prejudiced, a lot of xenophobia, a lot of fear-mongering towards Catholics and foreigners. They were afraid of the effect that it would have on American society. And then also social Darwinists. So we talked about in the last chapter how there was this view that economically, like survival of the fittest, to where if you were living in poverty, it was because you were unfit. Social Darwinists also believe that within society that these new immigrants as were racially inferior, socially inferior, biologically inferior. And so therefore they were just going to live in poverty, and they didn't want that poverty in the United States. Anytime there was an economic depression or recession, immigrants were a very convenient scapegoat. Again, when people were on downtime, and that's even something that you'll see today, is that there are certain groups that when times are tough, they look for someone to blame. And so if you're unemployed, the immigrants were very often a group that were blamed for the depression or the economic downturn. So urbanization is basically the increase of people living in cities. So urbanization and industrialization are happening at the same time. It's kind of like this, it's cyclical, or it's a push and a pull, push and pull. Cities provide both the laborers for the factories and a market for those goods. So we've talked about that as a cause of American industrialization, is that these immigrants that are living in the cities and working in the factories, they're the labor that spurs industrialization, but more importantly, they're also a market for the goods that are being purchased. They are the demand. There's a major shift in population from a rural to urban migration. But in 1900, 40% of Americans lived in towns or cities. By 1920, it's going to be over 50%. So for context, if you were to say the year 1800, in 1800, 80 to 90% of Americans lived in rural areas. So over the 19th century, there is a gradual shift from people living in rural areas and farms and being self-sufficient in the frontier to moving into cities, because remember that it's very difficult being a farmer. The price of crops and, overproduction and mechanization, all of this is very difficult for farmers to earn money. So if they had the opportunity to have a consistent wage, if they knew that they worked 6 days a week and they earned X amount of money, that consistent income was something that was worth it to them. Immigrants and migrants are moving into the cities, looking for that economic opportunity. So that's going to have changes within the cities. They're moving outward. Land value is going to go up as well. And eventually, because of technology that's happening simultaneously, the skyline is going to go up. So as the value of land within the cities, like that, in New York City or in any city, even in like downtown Winston-Salem, the land is much more expensive, or the price of rent and whatever it might be, because you're closer proximity to work and restaurants and things like that. So what they start to do is they're using steel like the steel that's being produced by Carnegie, and they are building skyscrapers. So a skyscraper is technically anything that is more than 10 stories. So before this, before the elevator, you really didn't see buildings that were taller than 5 stories, because the taller you go, you have to be willing to walk up that many flights of stairs. So with the invention of the Otis elevator, you see now, and also with the ability of steel to provide more stability and it's stronger, the buildings were stronger, you could now go up 10 whole stories, which was very tall back then. In addition to that, you had central heating systems. So you ever seen a radiator in like an old building? So in each room you would have a radiator, and so it's like a central heating system versus like wood burning stoves in each apartment or room in an urban apartment building, for example. So in addition to using steel for skyscrapers, you also had improvements in transportation. So streetcars were helpful in getting people to work and back and forth. Originally, you had horse-drawn streetcars, but they're going to be replaced by electric trolleys. There's going to be elevated railroads. So like in Chicago, their kind of like their subway is referred to as the L because it's elevated. Even today, subways are going to be built during this time period in order to transport people from the residential areas of cities to the factory portions. In addition to that, steel suspension bridges are going to improve transportation. So, for example, the Brooklyn Bridge in 1883 will connect Brooklyn, the borough of in Manhattan. The negative side of this is mass transportation is going to segregate urban workers by income, so socioeconomically. Wealthier people, the middle class, upper middle class, are going to move out of the crowded cities due to the fact that they have access to the streetcars or the subways. And so they're moving into suburbs in order to escape the noise and the pollution and the poverty, the crime. Because again, as more people move into these cities, that's just something that commonly happens, is that you have a rise in crime and poverty and unsanitary conditions. And so they're going to move out. And that's a continuity that you're going to see throughout even like the 20th century of, especially like after World War II, where not only like wealthy people are moving out of the cities, but it's predominantly a lot of white people are moving out of cities after the Great Migration. So this is an example of, and there's no text on this slide because I want to be able to kind of describe it to you. More and more poor immigrants are moving into apartments and residences near business and factories as the wealthy move out. In order to increase their profits, and because again, remember that these immigrants are making really low wages. So in order to increase profits, landlords are dividing up these inner city housing into small windowless rooms. Those are called tenement apartments. So what they would do is, so as you can see, these gentlemen, in order to save money, these are maybe birds of passage, if you will, These are young single men that are living in a one-room tenement apartment. Notice that there's no window. Notice that it's very cramped. Normally I put this up in the classroom and we talk about how many people do you think are in this room, and we've gotten anywhere between like 6 and 8 people that are living in this room. So really poor conditions. What we also know that is with that overcrowding, it's going to promote the spread of deadly diseases, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, because there's a lack of ventilation. Some of these city blocks, like in New York City, for example, they had more than 4,000 people in one city block. For us that live out in the suburbs and in rural areas, that's kind of hard to fathom. But that's a lot of people. Now, progressive wise, like when looking at like passing legislation to help people like this in poverty, it's going to start at the city level, and then it's going to move to state, and eventually during the progressive era, the federal government's going to come in and kind of help with living and working conditions. But one of the first laws passed in New York City required a window in each apartment. So what they did is they modified these tenements to what it was called a dumbbell tenement. So the image above my picture here, you'll notice that they carved out almost like a ventilation shaft in the middle of the building so that they could put a window in each apartment. So at least one window. They're still really small in size. At least then they have a window. And so if you've ever seen the images of kind of like this, I guess it's kind of like a corridor, whatever, where there's like clothing lines hanging between all the windows and stuff. That would be a dumbbell tenement. So new immigrants are also creating a distinct ethnic neighborhoods, like we talked about earlier. They're maintaining their own language and culture, their church or temple. Many groups have their own newspapers and schools, which again is going to contribute to a lot of the prejudice. As wealthy move out, there are 5 factors that promoted the wealthy moving into the suburbs. One was there's a lot of land at low cost. It was inexpensive transportation with like the streetcars and the subway. Low cost construction, so wooden framed homes. Again, a push factor for people leaving the cities and moving into the suburbs is going to be that ethnic and racial prejudice. And then this American dream of like a yard and grass, the privacy of a detached home, that's what people kind of wanted. It had this connection with the American dream. Frederick Law Olmsted was a like almost like a landscape architect. I guess that's what he would be called. He designed Central Park in the 1860s. He's going to design suburb neighborhoods that had these like nice lawns. He was also hired by Vanderbilt and designed and did all the landscaping for the hundreds of acres at the Biltmore Estate in Asheville. So at first, when you're looking at how cities functioned, today when we look at utility companies, they're owned by the city or the county, right? So a utility is like water, for example. At first, during this period of time, private companies were the ones that provided utilities and transportation for profit. And these cities were full of disease, crime, waste. There was no like sanitation systems. There was a lot of water and air pollution. And so that convinced a lot of reformers the need for municipal. So that means anytime you see the word municipal, that means like city or local. And they're looking for water purification. They need sewer systems, waste disposal, street lighting, because again, if the streets are lit at night, maybe there'll be less crime. They want city-funded police departments. They want zoning laws to regulate where like residential areas are from, commercial or factories. And so this is the first kind of reform within cities that you're going to see. And that's important in understanding, like with a progressive era that's going to happen really in the early 1900s through like 1920, is that it's going to start at the city level. And then eventually the federal government is going to step in and put certain regulations. So the City Beautiful movement began in the 1890s, where it's like, we need to really try to make these cities to be a more pleasant place to live and work. Putting trees, and you'll even note like the next time you walk through a city, if you notice that there are trees that line between the sidewalk and the street, having public parks in the city to provide for people and children to like play where they're not playing in the streets and in dangerous conditions. This kind of obsession with like grass and shrubs and things like that. Those weren't things that existed in cities before this campaign in the late 1890s. Now, we talked about kind of the economic part of cities and society, but in addition to that, there's a lot of political issues that are going on. Because there's a consolidation of power in businesses, that's going to parallel also in urban politics or in city politics. A political machine is this tightly organized group of politicians within a political party. Political machines existed in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Each machine has its own boss. That's the top politician that's going to kind of give orders to the other people. So it could be the mayor, it could be the county commissioner, it could be like a sheriff or a police chief. And they would kind of be in charge of that political party and the people that served under that political party within the city. And their basic idea is that they rewarded people for party loyalty by giving them government jobs. So it's basically patronage. Tammany Hall was the largest, most powerful political machine in New York City. It was the Democratic Party. There was a lot of corruption. It was led by a guy by the name of William Boss Tweed. He was known as Boss Tweed. And the basic idea of a political machine is, and they used immigrants to their advantage. So a lot of immigrants voted with the Democratic Party in these cities. And they would coordinate the needs of these immigrants or businesses in return for votes on election day. So imagine you're an immigrant, you get off the boat. One of the first things that you need is a job. And so what they would have these political machine warriors, I guess, these people that would find you. They would have connections with businesses. They would say, hey, listen, I'll get you a job. I'll get you somewhere to stay. But on election day, the idea was that you return the favor and you show up to vote, and they would make sure that you vote. And there was a lot of violence and intimidation with that. Sometimes they would they did some good things too. Let's say that you're injured on the job because of the dangerous working conditions and you can't work. Sometimes they would give you your family food and kind of help you through that hard time. But again, you need to vote for them. And if you didn't vote for them, like there was violence. And you're probably wondering, well, how? Like they're showing up at apartment buildings and they are, standing and watching you vote. There's no such thing as like a private ballot at that point in time. And so there was a lot of pressure and intimidation to make sure that you're voting for them. Now, unfortunately, Tammany Hall stole millions of dollars worth of taxpayers. So because they were in control politically, they were in, and no one really questioned them and no one ever ran against them. They were able to extort money. So Boss Tweed, for example, 65% of the building funds in the 1860s ended up in the pocket of Boss Tweed and kind of his cronies. So what they did is they would say, this new city hall is going to cost X amount of money. But what they did is they embezzled most of those taxpayer dollars. So in order to reform or to make better these conditions of urban poverty, it was the working class that came in and attempted to improve the conditions. So remember that, and this is even the case of those antebellum reformers that we talked about with like abolition and temperance, is that these are people that have the privilege and the time to be able to improve conditions. Most working class poor people are spending 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day in the factories. They don't have the time or energy to try and improve their life. So it's the middle class that are stepping in order to help them. So they're bringing attention to the inequalities. They're writing books. So you have Progress in Poverty, Looking Backward, where they're trying to draw attention to the disparities between the wealthy, the middle class, and the urban poor. These books are going to kind of shift public opinion away from a pure laissez-faire view of capitalism toward more government regulation. And that also is happening at the same time as, they're worried about industrialization and the growth of monopolies and the reduction of competition, which is affecting prices. So it's going to we're leading towards a more progressive era of reform. But before the federal government ever steps in, again, it's happening privately and it's happening locally. So, for example, Jane Addams is going to found the Hull House in Chicago in 1889. A settlement house was a place where urban immigrants, and they're in these neighborhoods where you could live and get job training. Most of the people that work there are young, educated, middle-class women and men, and they're trying to provide these services. So think of these as the first social workers. They would teach English to immigrants. They provided daycares. The first kindergarten came out of a settlement house. And the idea of early education and early intervention for young immigrant children in order to kind of help them, provide them opportunities to make their way out of poverty. They would also teach these women, immigrant women, skills like how to sew and cook and housekeeping. So this is job training for that period of time. Because remember that domestic service and domestic help for the wealthy people was in demand at that point in time. How religion inspired those antebellum reformers that we talked about before the Civil War, where it was the Second Great Awakening that inspired them to improve society. There were also people during this era where they're inspired by religion. So the social gospel was this Protestant push to help the urban poor. They're trying to apply Christian principles to help social problems. So Walter Rauschenbusch, he's a New York Baptist minister. He was a leader of the movement. He inspired a lot of middle and upper class Protestants to reform some of these urban problems. Again, remember, this is not the federal government quite yet playing a role in improving living and working conditions. This is private organizations and private groups that are the root of the progressive reform, and eventually it's going to inspire city reform, state reform, and then the federal government during the progressive era. So city life is extremely different than that of rural area. Isolated families from the extended family, divorce rates are going to increase in cities. 1 in 12 marriages by 1900 ended in divorce. State legislatures are going to expand the grounds for why you could file for divorce. So a lot of women were given more rights. And that kind of happened after the Civil War, where women would, like, maybe their husbands, were abusing them, or they all out deserted them and just left them. A lot of Civil War veterans who struggled with probably what we would consider post-traumatic stress or mental issues after the war abandoned their families. And so you could file for divorce. And so a lot of women did. There's a decrease in birth rate for the first time during this time period. If you think about living on a rural farm, we've talked about how children were an asset. They are hands to help on the farm. But once you move into the cities, those children become, instead of an asset, they become more of a liability. It's more mouths to feed. It's more pressure to bring in money. And so you do see a decline in birth rate, in addition to the fact that there were female reformers that were teaching these immigrant women different birth control practices, just so you can control, because a lot of time, with reproductive health, one of the big issues is that, women are kind of, when they have a lot of children, well, one, it can be bad on them, their health, but also just having to take care of those children. A lot of these people are in poverty. And so if they can limit the number of children they have, that was something that they wanted to do in most cases. So with that, women are still trying to fight for their right to vote. So the National American Women's Suffrage Association was founded in 1890 by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Remember, these were the women that all the way in 1848, were arguing for more rights for women. And now Susan B. Anthony had kind of this radical idea of women voting after the Civil War, and how women contributed. A lot of women started to kind of go with this more radical idea. Their goal is to secure the vote for women. Wyoming is the first state to grant suffrage to women in 1869. So it started out in different states, mostly in Western states. There's political scientists that have looked into the history of that and why it was that these Western states like Montana and Wyoming were more willing to give women the right to vote. A lot of it has to do with men were busy with their ranches and their business, and so they didn't want to be bothered by politics, which is really interesting. And so the women would handle it. Whereas like in the East Coast and urban cities, political power equaled economic power. We know there was a lot of corruption associated with it. Most states allowed women to own or control property in the case of their husband's death by this point in time, where you're still going to see kind of a more traditional view of women not inheriting property and owning property is going to probably be in some of those southern states. And that's just kind of the history of, the planter system and the patriarchy and all of that. Temperance movement is still attracting a lot of urban reformers. Remember that, women were the ones that were being, physically and verbally abused by drunk husbands. The wages are really low. Factory workers are spending the little amount that they do have on alcohol instead of feeding their children. And so women were the ones that really pushed for temperance. You have the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, the Anti-Saloon League. Carrie A. Nation is a really interesting woman. She's from Kansas, and she carried a hatchet, and she was known for going around to saloons and jumping over the bar and, cracking open all the barrels of whiskey and beer. So she was a little bit more, I guess, she wasn't willing to wait for the laws. She wanted to take it into her own hands. The 18th Amendment will eventually be passed around the time of World War I, and we'll get to that in the coming weeks. So compulsory education was also a part of urban society. Increased attendance of schools during this time period resulted in literacy rates increasing by 90%. So 90% of the population could read and write by 1900. There was more and more interest thanks to those settlement houses and early childhood education and kindergarten, and it's all tax supported. So, and originally, it would be your basic reading, writing, arithmetic. So most children would be educated by the time, like, I guess the equivalent would be like 6th or 7th grade. But now more tax-supported high schools were growing in support in a lot of these cities. And so that was something that was different. In rural areas, it was still like you need to know how to read and write and count. And then after that, like you don't need to study like American literature or anything like that. But in cities, you did see a growth in high schools. Okay. So that's all I'm going to talk about today. In your book, it talks a little bit more about American culture, but I wanted to hit the highlights for today of the chapter. I hope you learned something, and I will see you next time. Bye.